Okay, thanks for having me back. I really enjoyed the first session, and now we're in the home stretch. I'm going to just begin by doing a quick overview of what we covered the first time. Those of you who were there, it will sound familiar. Those of you, if you're tuning in for the first time, you can watch a recording of the first half. It's on both my LinkedIn profile page, as well as I think Jane had posted it. And we're going to get to some of the more fun stuff today, like how to spot, potential toxic workplaces when you're interviewing, right? Doesn't everyone want to know that, so that you can not work in those places? But first, let's review what we did in the first half of this 2 weeks ago. We began by further defining what a toxic workplace culture is, as opposed to just like a not so great, mediocre place to work, because there is a difference. Then we went into two different types of toxic leaders, and we delved into some of the material from a guy named Timothy Clark. I encourage you to look him up if you haven't already done so. He is the CEO of a company called Leader Factor. It's one word. And he offers a lot of free webinars and things on topics such as workplace psychological safety and culture and inclusion, et cetera, et cetera. In addition, he wrote the book, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, which was one of the topics that we began last time. So we talked about two different types of workplace, toxic workplace leaders, which were actively toxic and passively complicit. Then we distinguished between the two types of toxic work environments, and that was first generation and multi-generational. From there, we talked about the unhealthy toxic tools of influence that such leaders use, things like fear and manipulation. And then finally, we ended with psychological safety. Both psychological safety in the workplace as well as trust are two, I'll call it, combatants of workplace toxicity. If you have a work environment that is high in psychological safety amongst its staff, as well as high organizational and team trust, then you're probably not going to have a toxic work environment. And of course, the opposite is true. Toxic work environments lack both psychological safety as well as organizational and team trust. So we're going to begin today by doing the very tail end of psychological safety. Then we're going to move into organizational trust. From there, we will talk about ways to avoid and remedy toxicity in the workplace. And finally, we will end with how to potentially spot toxic leaders and workplace environments when interviewing, whether you're currently interviewing right now, or you think at some point in your career you will interview again, or if you want to make this switch in your head, if you yourself are a hiring manager and you want to make sure that the presentation that you give to your prospective employees conveys non-toxicity, genuine non-toxicity, then you want to pay attention to that section as well, because you want to avoid doing the things that I will describe happen in toxic interviews, okay? And throughout, just like the first session that we did 2 weeks ago, I'm going to invite you guys to participate, ask questions, answer questions that I throw out there. If you'd like to be on camera, that would be great. I have my view set on gallery so I can see all of you. But if you prefer to stay off camera, that's fine as well. That shouldn't impact your ability to participate if you would like to. And I know that Jane and Mike have a few things that they want to say at the end of this meeting, so I'm going to try to wrap up at least 10 minutes before the end of the meeting. Okay, so before I begin, does anyone have any questions from either part 1 or anything that they want to say right now before we get into part 2? Okay, then let's get started. All right, so I want to wrap up, as I said, the very tail end of psychological safety. For those of us who are leaders, whether you are someone's direct supervisor or middle management or upper executive, any level of leadership, it's very important that you do a self-inventory about your leadership style and be, insightful and humble enough to recognize when you are excelling in fostering inclusion and safety and trust and collaboration amongst your team members, and where there might be spots that you could improve. So I'm going to list for you 5 ways that you can tell if others on your team feel safe with you. Okay. So one is, are the team members engaging in humor and bonding, not only with one another, but also with you? So think about that. Think back, when you've seen, particularly when we were all back in the office, are people having inside jokes and talking and, sharing pictures of their kids and things like that with one another, but they never approach you, the boss? Think about that. Another thing is team members know non-working things about one another and you. Now, of course, this is within professional parameters, but, things like, do they know you have a dog? Do they know that, Bob likes skiing? Just things like that. People ask questions. When your team does not feel safe with you, they will likely not ask questions, even when they should be, even when they need to. So one sign that you are engendering psychological safety within your team is that they feel comfortable enough to ask you questions. Number 4 on the list is that people offer spontaneous feedback. If you think back about times where you felt maybe intimidated by a boss, or that your boss would just randomly rail on you, or, things like that, that made it a really, unsafe work environment, you probably did not feel very comfortable or free to offer spontaneous feedback. Even when they asked for feedback, you probably had voices in your head going, oh my God, how do I word this? What should I tell them? What's gonna, set them off? What's gonna risk my job? So if people feel just spontaneously able to give you feedback about whatever ideas you've put forth, or making suggestions about improvements, whatever the idea, feedback might be, then that's a sign that they feel safe with you. And then finally, that you hear about problems. If you have found in your leadership that no one ever presents problems to you, and you're like, well, that's great, my team must be fine, there's no problems, I encourage you to think about that, because when in life are there never any problems, right? When in life do you have a group of people together who always think everything is great and nothing could be improved and nothing could be different? So if your team feels comfortable enough to share with you and let you know when there are problems, whether it's about the work, or they're having difficulty working with a coworker, or they're finding it hard to get resources from another department, whatever the workplace issue might be, if you are finding that you're not hearing about those things, then that might suggest that they don't view you as being approachable or safe, as someone that they could go to as a resource to help problem solve or advocate for them, right? So those are just 5 things just to finish our discussion on psychological safety. Before we move on to trust, which is that close cousin of the other dynamic that you absolutely want to have in the workplace, does anyone have any final thoughts or questions about psychological safety in the workplace? Okay, then let's just move right into trust. So I want to begin by reading you a few statistics that I think are pretty impactful, because when we talk about things like safety and trust, I know some people are like, oh, well, what world are you living in? I live in the real world where bosses are nasty because they can be. And, it's a go for-profit organization, and we're trading stocks and whatever. I don't know anything about finance, but, a lot of people will be like, well, that's touchy-feely. That's what the millennials and Gen Zers want. That's not realistic. But I want to share with you some statistics that hopefully will just give you some insight. I could talk about research for the next 4 hours that buttress what I'm about to present to you, but I want to give you just a few statistics that will show you in hard data how important and impactful trust in an organization is, and why we should do everything we can to cultivate it amongst our teams. So, first statistic: organizations with high levels of trust have 50% less turnover. 50%. That's huge. Talk about statistically significant. We're not talking about, 5%, 50% less turnover with high trust in an organization. Research doesn't get better than that. And by the way, the research that I'm quoting is from, big companies, big data machines, like ADP and Deloitte and, those types of things. These aren't just one-off, studies that someone did in graduate school for a project. Next statistic I want to share. Committed and engaged employees who trust their leaders perform 20% better and are 87% less likely to leave the organization. They perform 20% better and they are 87% less likely to leave the organization if they are engaged and committed and trust their leaders. Again, these are not small numbers. This is huge. And this is just measuring trust. I'm not even talking about all the other best practices for leadership and team building. And then the third point that I want to mention is that without trust, study after study shows there is a loss in productivity, a lack of commitment, less innovation, lower retention, and a culture that is not engaged. I'll go over that one more time. Without trust, there is a loss in productivity, a lack of commitment from your team, less innovation, that's never good, lower retention, and a culture that is not engaged. So the bottom line is you have to, as a leader, prioritize engendering and fostering trust. So that is what we're going to talk about right now. We're going to begin with the 3 levels of trust. In a workplace, there are 3 different types of trust. At the highest level is trust in the organization. Then in the middle, you have trust in your team. And finally, you have individual trust within individual people, okay? So let's flesh that out so that we have a common language that we can use to talk about this. Organizational trust, the definition is very simple. It's the belief that an individual has in the company. It's the level of trust that you have in your company, okay? So a company will accomplish this by their values, both what is stated and what they actually embody, right? We all know that every single company has a mission statement, a value statement, a vision statement, but we also know that many companies don't walk the walk when it comes to their values. They may say that we embrace diversity and, we foster inclusion, except that those who really work there are like, no, that's just some, malarkey that they have put on their website, to please their, investors. So one sure way, one primary way to make sure that your employees have trust in the organization is that organization has to walk the walk, not just talk the talk, when it comes to their values, both their values for their internal customers, AKA their employees, as well as their external customers, whomever that might be, people who buy the tires that you make, whatever that is. Also, organizations have strategies and goals. Well, whatever those are, that also impacts the level of trust that staff have in the organization, right? How the company goes about accomplishing whatever it is that is set in their mission statement. What are the goals that they set? What are the strategies? How are they getting from point A to point B? Because even if point B is a lofty, laudable goal, if they're getting there by driving their employees, to working, 80 hours a week and never being able to take vacation, et cetera, well, then that is also not going to build trust, because the employees will know that you don't actually care about them. You just care about making more tires. How information is communicated and the degree of transparency. The thing with all of these best practices, anytime people talk about leadership best practices, is that it starts with us, we leaders. We have to be the ones to first be humble and insightful and vulnerable and transparent. We have to model that for our team. And that can be a bit scary and nerve-wracking because, as a leader, you might think, well, I'm supposed to be the one who knows more than my team. I'm supposed to be the one that they come to for support. I have to be strong, or whatever voices, we have in our head, whatever scripts. But really, in fact, it is so helpful when a team can see that their leader needs some work, life balance, or their leader is really going to be unplugged during a vacation. That is how you engender, transparency and motivate your staff to then follow in line. 2 other things about how you can accomplish organizational trust. how individuals and teams are treated, and then the overall character and style of the company's leadership. Okay, it always begins with leadership, always, always, always. All right, now let's take it down the next level to team trust. Team can be either a small working team, it can be your entire department, a certain division, a project team, right? We're a part of many different teams when we're at work. So what team trust is how teams demonstrate the behaviors that build and sustain trust. So how that team functions and how they show, again, it's all about walking the walk, how they show that you should trust in their process and trust your teammates, not to mention your team leader. So this is accomplished by how the team is created, right? It begins with inclusion. Who even gets invited to be part of the team? If you are talking about being, for example, an anti-racist organization, and so you have a DEI team, and there is no person of color on that team, or there is no LGBTQ person on that team, or there is no neurodiverse person on that team, or I could keep going on and on, any measure of diversity, then you're doing it wrong. And the rest of the organization will not trust any work that comes from that team, right? Because it's all about how did that team even get formed, right? It's also accomplished, meaning team trust is also accomplished by what are the team objectives? What are the norms, right? Last time we talked about unwritten rules, right? There's written rules like the program manual or the company policy, but then there's the unwritten rules. Some of you might remember that I worked in a place where the chief program officer deemed you late to a meeting if you were any less than 15 minutes early to the meeting. That was not ever written. We all learned that trial by fire. So what are the team rules? What are the team norms, right? What are the roles within the team? So, if you have a team of all men and one woman, first of all, it's not very diverse, right? At least on gender lines. But second of all, if the team leader asks just that woman every single time to be the one to set up the coffee and clean up after, what are the roles of the people part of that team? What message is that sending out, particularly to the woman, but also to the men on the team? And then finally, how is accountability administered? Okay, so all of these aspects of when creating a team, a lot of times we're just busy at work. We're just like, hey, Chris and Kathy and Cynthia, come with me. We need to create a team. We got to problem solve this. The CEO just, emailed me or whatever. But the more that we can give forethought, even if we just take 5 minutes to think about, all right, you know what? Let me also bring in Susan, because Susan, brings some type of diversity of thought, or she's a culture add instead of a culture fit. All of those best practices that we talk about, we always have to be thinking about them because the ramifications, whether it's good or bad, will surely come, right? So it always starts with leadership. I'm just going to keep saying that. It's like a loop, right? We should get t-shirts that say it always starts with leadership. And then lastly, the final level of trust is individual, trust in people. So how trust is given and earned between people to create meaningful, productive relationships. This is what we do both in our personal lives and our work lives, right? So it's accomplished through our interactions. Jane was kind enough to invite me to speak today with all of you. I have earned her trust by showing up. If I didn't show up, clearly she would not trust me to invite me to become a speaker again at some point in the future, if she so desired, right? That is an interaction between us. And of course it involves all of you as well, because I would have wasted all of your time. But certainly her level of individual trust in me was supported by the fact that I showed up. I did what I said I would do. So I'm going to go over one more thing about trust, and then let's open up the dialogue, all right? So that you don't just hear me talking at you, on what feels like a Monday morning, because yesterday was a holiday. So one way to remember some of the things, some of the best principles when it comes to trust are the ABCDs of trust. And as you can imagine, there's going to be an acronym coming in here. So the ABCDs of trust. A is for able. A is for able. That's demonstrating your competence, okay? So I am giving this presentation. And as I said, in both parts 1 and part 2. Some of the material I've gotten has been from Timothy Clark and other sources. But the bottom line, at the end of the day, do you feel as though, do you believe that I am at least somewhat competent? Do I know something about what I'm talking about? Or do I sound like a total idiot and everything I'm saying left and right, you can fact check in your head, is totally wrong, right? So A is able. Am I able to even speak on this topic? B, believable. I act with integrity, right? So we all know what integrity is, but do you believe that if I say to you, I will show up in 2 weeks, time from now, that I will? C is for connected. It means that you care about others. Okay. So if you're walking through your office and you see, Ariel crying in her cubicle, do you stop and say, oh my God, Ariel, like, are you okay? Is there anything I can help with? Just showing some level of care for your staff. So C is for connected. And this engenders trust, right? Because you can be, strictly businesslike and be super parochial in following, boundaries, professional boundaries and things like that. But you also have to be a human. No one is suggesting that you have inappropriate relationships with your staff or that you start talking about, the nitty gritty of the divorce that you're going through with your team. I mean, we're not talking about that type of thing, but be human. Show some level of connection and care, right? Because after all, we are working with humans, although more and more robots, but that's a whole other presentation. And then D, finally, is dependable, that you honor your commitments, right? Just think about people in your personal life that you trust. Who, if I just said to you right now, who do you trust the most in your life? A name is going to pop up in your head. It might be your mother. It might be your wife. It might be your brother. It might be your best friend, whoever that is. I bet you they cover the ABCDs of what we just went through, right? So when it comes to leaders, I mean, really everyone in an organization should strive to comply with the ABCDs, but particularly leaders, we have to embody all 4 of these. We can't just have 2 and not the other 2, because then that just absolutely erodes the trust that our team has in us. So I am going to take a break from just throwing information at you. And I really would love to invite you to share a story about either an example of where you felt a high level of trust in your organization. And not only how did that make you feel as an employee, but how did that impact the work or the culture? Or conversely, if you have a story of where you were in a work environment where you experienced low trust, and how did that make you feel, or how did that impact the work of either your own workload or the team? So does anyone have any examples they'd like to share?
I'll break in there. So, this is something that I've kind of been tracking or kind of putting a plan together for the last 20, 25 years. I worked in an environment that was, it depended on who you are and what position you had, how successful you felt as a person there, or how you kind of were interacted with top down in that company. And when I became a manager, I started thinking, well, how do I avoid this? How do I avoid my people feeling like I did and the people that I talked to did at that company? And it's funny that you talk about these concepts of how you interact and the trust that you build. We're going through a difficult time at work now, and I've always incorporated kind of the 12 steps that I've developed over the years. And everybody will, I know it's working. I know my management still kind of fights the system that I like, but I know it works. Every place I go, it works, because I've had people calling me, and they complain to me. Sometimes I feel more like a psychologist than a manager. But I feel like as a manager, I owe it to them to have those discussions. Unfortunately, 2 guys just left. They just up and left the team because of it. But I understood why they were leaving, and I understand the changes that need to be made. But I don't know that. And people always kind of throw everything on HR, and I think HR plays a huge role in this. But it's really the field leaders and the managers the C-suite people, I'm telling you, that really dictate what goes on, because HR to a lot of employees is just another part of the organization. They are not the voice or the face of the organization like the sales VP is, or the VP of marketing or whatever. So I really feel that that's where it needs to start. Yeah, it starts with HR, but really, as far as the general population of the organization goes, it starts with management down. And I found that every time I employ those simple 12 steps, it changes the ball game for me personally in the company. So that's
Thank you for that, Bob. You just threw at us a whole bunch of gems. First of all, I would love to hear what that 12 list is. I feel like you should do a talk on the 12, list, the 12 steps, right? You mentioned, how important management is. You're 1,000% right. People are either engaged or they leave most often because of management. Yes, every once in a while it's because their family is moving to another state, or because they found an opportunity that has a more competitive salary, sure. But those things are easy to control. It's the relationship with your direct supervisor. How much interaction are you having with them? How clear are they with you about your performance, how you're doing? How much are they contributing towards your own career development, mentoring, sponsoring? Are they toxic or aren't they? Absolutely. That is the number one thing that keeps employees engaged and retained, for sure. You also talked about top-down management, which has its place in time. For example, I used to work in a very high crisis-ridden work environment where there were times during critical incidents where you have to have top-down management. Jane, you do this, Mike, you call 911, et cetera, et cetera. But otherwise, top-down management doesn't really work. We learned that however many years ago from Toyota, right? People are still following the Toyota model as an example. I'm not suggesting that's the only management or leadership style, but as you all probably know, anyone on the assembly line in Toyota, for example, can stop the presses, which is costly, if they feel like something is not going right. I'm really very simplifying the Toyota model, but no, those are all excellent points that you made, Bob.
So with the top down thing, while we're on that, is that's the problem, right? We say, you have the right to stop working in an unsafe environment. When you do that, when an employee does that, now how does that management react to that?
Exactly.
Is the top down that I'm talking about.
Exactly.
It's that integrity or that walk the walk that you were talking about. But just to give you an example of my biggest thing, the one gentleman that left, he was telling me, I just don't feel like I'm valued. And we started into this conversation, right? And, I said, and finally I asked him, I said, send me your resume, because he was telling me his resume had all this stuff. And I'm like, because his boss is my boss. And I know our boss didn't feel that way about him. When he sent me his resume and I saw what he had done in the past, and for someone to say to him, well, this will be a good learning experience from you. This is a guy who ran 65 locations and was manager of the year 2 years in a row for organizational development. If you don't know that about your employee, there's your problem, because he's going to walk. And you know what he did? He walked.
Yeah. And remember, the C in the ABCDs of trust is connected. You have to be a human to the humans who work with you, right? Okay, great stuff, Bob. Thank you. Yes, Jane.
You had me at, this is important. I really understand that. But as a recruiter, first and foremost, my ears perked up when you said, if there's no trust, people leave. And what I don't understand is why companies don't invest the money in training the management and the whole team to say, okay, we just hired Bob. He's a gem. And it's up to you to keep him. So here are the 12 steps, or here are the 4 steps. And it's in your tail if he leaves, unless he has a family crisis or what, you know what I mean? I know that's super simple, but I've had managers, bosses, whatever before, that if they just treated me better, I would have worked 24/7 for them as much as I could. You know what I mean? So yeah. And I always tell my employers, basically, I find them, you keep them.
Yes.
You make them happy, and I will gladly send you more people if you need more. But you know how that, I mean, it drives me nuts because you treat people
Right.
well, and they stay. You treat them not well, they're going to be looking. And when they find something, they're hopping off. So
I hear you. One of my primary professional passions is leadership development at all levels, you know? Yes. All right. Now I'm mindful of time, so I want to move on because we have a lot more to cover and I want to give Mike and Jane time at the end as they had asked. So let's move on to how can you avoid or remedy toxic work culture? Okay. I have a number of tips that I'm going to share with you. I'm just going to, go down my list. And then afterwards, if anyone else has any other tips that they would like to air and share with the group, please do. So the first one, as we talked in part 1 of this presentation 2 weeks ago, get rid of actively toxic leaders. Remember, we had talked about the passively complicit ones can be remedied. They can be rehabilitated if they want to be, right? But actively toxic leaders who are actively abusive and all they care about is their own image and what's in it for them, get rid of them. And I know a lot of companies struggle with that because that's your top salesperson or that's, whatever, the grandson of, one of the investors, who knows? But that is just, if you want my best practices, get rid of them. Moving on. Employers need to stop promoting employees based upon simply high performance. You also have to incorporate their softer skills, their ability to instill psychological safety. This also has to do with, hiring, not just promoting, their ability to cultivate teams, collaborate with one another. Yes, of course, they have to meet the basic standards of the hard skills in order to get that promotion or be hired into that position. But equally important, one could even argue possibly a little more important, are those softer skills. Okay. Also, as I've said before, make sure that when hiring or compiling a team or project that you are focusing on a culture add, not just a culture fit. Okay. The difference is that with a culture add, you will increase your diversity, whether that's diversity of thought, diversity in other ways, which will then lead to more creativity and innovation, production. So for example, I have interviewed at more than one company where they tend to just hire from the school from which the CEO graduated. This has happened more than once. Well, it might be a fantastic school. It might even be an Ivy League school. But if everyone has been trained in the same way, then that is a very vanilla, we'll call it, culture. So you want a culture add, right, with other types of backgrounds and experiences. Embrace and foster diversity of thought, right? That's where we get the innovation and the creativity and people asking questions and contributing new ideas. Make sure that you always tie everything to the company's mission and values. That's why I said a little earlier, it all starts with leadership, first of all, coming up with a worthwhile mission and values, right? That they've actually put some thought into that, but that they then live that, they then walk that walk. They don't just talk that talk. So then everything that every department does in the company ties back to that central, theology, let's say that central philosophy and belief system that everyone has signed on. Because when you interview with prospective companies, you're not only looking at what job will you do, but you're looking at, well, what does that company do on the whole? Do I believe in what they do? Do they have corporate social responsibility? Do they give back to the community? Whatever their ideals are. And so if then I start working there and everything we do is inconsistent with that mission and those values, well, then how am I feeling about working there, right? Another best practice is have multiple streams of feedback from your employees. Some of it should be direct face-to-face. I'm meeting with Howard for one-on-one, individual supervision. I'm going to ask Howard, hey, Howard, do you have any questions, any thoughts, any concerns? And hopefully I have engendered enough trust and psychological safety that Howard feels comfortable being honest with me. But even in the best of companies, right, however we want to define that, there may be things that Howard's like, I just don't know that that's smart for me to say right to my boss. So have other methods of feedback, whether that's, suggestion boxes or something through the company's intranet with, pulse surveys, anonymous, asking staff like through, Survey Monkey or things like that, how they're feeling, if they have any thoughts or concerns, so have multiple streams of feedback. And then two more things. Make sure that you offer mentoring, stay interviews, leadership development, as we were just talking about, right? And the leadership development, should include things like psychological safety, toxicity, trust, not just things like how can you conduct a good supervision and get the most out of your staff, right? That's very tactical, but also make sure that you're training on these softer skills. With stay interviews, I can't remember if we talked about this in part one, but stay interviews are different than exit interviews. Exit interviews, we're all used to that. We've been doing this for decades, where someone is leaving for whatever reason, and then usually HR comes in and says, either they send you a survey or in person, they ask, how come you're leaving? Do you have any suggestions of how we can do things better? At that point, it's too late. First of all, the chances of that person being honest at that point are not high. And second of all, the damage is done if there is damage to be learned from an exit interview. A stay interview is something that every single manager should be doing on a regular basis with their individual direct reports, where you're asking things like, same questions like, do you have any concerns? Do you have any suggestions? How are you feeling about work? But things like, what else could we do to help support you in your role? What other resources or training do you need? Do you have a clear understanding of what's expected of you? Do you feel as though you are utilizing all of your skills in the way that you would like to? Questions like that. That's a stay interview with the aim of getting that person to stay and be fully engaged and happy, and then in turn giving back to the organization, which will benefit the organization. So after that whole list of best practices, does anyone else have any suggestions or things that they've done in their current or past roles that would either prevent or remedy workplace toxicity? Ariel?
I'm going to do this from the employee relations HR perspective that maybe people won't like, but in my experience, most companies do not do a good job of let's say, coaching their managers, right? So if the manager has bad behavior, very often people don't come forward because they're afraid of retaliation. In other situations, many people come forward, but the leaders are afraid to lose the person, or they've never said anything all those 20 years, the person's been behaving badly, and now they don't know what to do. So instead of consulting HR or, employment, the legal employment law area, they just keep going. They just, it's a real problem. I mean, I've seen that really, I'm going to say very unscientifically, 80% of the time. It's a rare manager or leader, I'm going to say leader because they're at the top, that will actually say, okay, tell me what I need to do. I have spent 30 years pushing back on so many leaders, and in the end, it's really rare that they will decide to say, okay, let's start the process. So I'm not downgrading. I don't want to be negative, and I don't want to challenge you. You are absolutely correct. All these things need to happen. In reality, it's very difficult. So, I'm going to say that if you're somewhere and you're in a position to make a change, pick one first and do the best that you can, know which battles to fight, because in the end, it's going to be what's in it for us. Your senior leader is going to say, well, what's in it for me to piss off Janet? What's in it for me? And there are many things that are in it for them. So you need to show them the risk of, the harm to the company, the harm to the employee, the harm to the culture. There are so many things. And then you have to quantify it a little bit, because if that person comes forward, and many people can come forward and claim retaliation, and there's no way for a lawyer to prove it, and they will win money. So they won't be shy about going out to their neighbor who may be a divorce attorney, which has been done to me before, and say, hey, listen, they did this to me. And the divorce attorney starts these, oh, we'll go to the EEOC together. So What I'm saying is that if you're a leader and you're in a position to do something, I understand that it's a tough situation, but sit down with your HR department, sit down with employment law if it's a smaller company, and think about what is the first thing that you can do, because to start it is the most important. To not start it, you're going to keep perpetuating the toxic environment.
Yeah, and I love that, to make it doable, to prioritize, and you're right, start with one thing, then do another thing. And it is an ongoing process. It's not like an organization can say, all right, we're going to spend the next 3 months and make this a trustworthy organization. It's like, for example, a relationship, either a friendship or a marriage, where it's a lifelong process of communicating, checking in with one another, adjusting. Absolutely. Thank you, Ariel. Great. Okay. Again, in the interest of time, I want to move to the final section, which I think some of you might have been really excited about, which is how you can detect potential toxic leaders and toxic workplace environments when interviewing. Or, as I said at the beginning of this section, in turn, reflecting on yourself when you are doing interviewing. Are you doing any of these things or not doing any of these things? Because what image are you projecting to potential hires? Okay, so this will be our final section. Then I'm going to open it up to you guys for feedback. And then I know that Jane and Mike want to say a few words at the end of this. So once again, I'm going to go through a list of suggestions and best practices, and we'll take it from there. So we've talked about unwritten rules. Ask what those are. Now, that might not be something you can ask in an interview with a CEO, but when you are doing your internal networking, you know how it is suggested that when you're trying to get a job somewhere, see who you know who's already working in the company and have a chat with them and ask them questions. One of the questions could be, what are some of the unwritten rules? What is the culture like there, right? If you get the opportunity to interview in person in the office, I know with COVID, sometimes that doesn't happen now. Look around, okay? Are people working well into the evening, into late hours? Are they working through lunch? Do they have what I call personal artifacts in their workspaces, personal items? Do they have a picture of their dog? Do they have a ski pass from their trip to Vail? Like whatever, however a plant, anything that would suggest that they would not not hesitate in 2 seconds just to up and leave and quit and leave. Do they feel rooted and connected to their workspace? Are people talking with one another about non-work topics? If you happen to take a break from the interview and go to the bathroom, do you hear, Kathy and Chris, talking about their holiday weekend plans, right? Or are they just like, oh my God, the boss is on me, I got to get this, please, marketing, blah, right? So pay attention, look around when you're in person interviewing. Also, take note of what I call double bind messages or mixed messages. I was on an interview once where the COO had said to me, okay, and you would get, this number of vacation days, which took, 3 seconds, to say that. Then he spent a full minute and a half telling me when I couldn't take vacation. So that's a mixed message. It's a double bind message. It's like, okay, so what I'm hearing is that I can basically never take vacation, right? Pay attention to the benefits that are being offered. I know this might sound like an obvious one, but not only, PTO, paid time off, but do they offer continuing education more than just regular tuition reimbursement? Do they offer any wellness services to the employees? Do they have employee resource groups? Is there an LGBTQ group? Is there a neurodiversity group? Is there a veterans group? Whatever. These are all signs that the company actually cares about its employees and its culture. Always ask if you can have the opportunity to speak with other people before you, sign on to work there. Can you meet your prospective employees if you're in a position where people would report to you? Can you talk with prospective teammates, colleagues, other leaders in the organization if they haven't already built that into the interview process? If they have, well, that's a good sign that might be a positive, culture to work in. If they haven't, ask. I mean, what's the worst? They could say no, but you want to take advantage of that if possible. Ask about both the overall turnover in either the department or company, but also ask why your role is vacant. Ask what supports will be in place to help ensure the success of your role. And, pay attention, have they thought about this? If you ask that question, if I'm interviewing with Jane and I say, tell me a little bit about, what supports will be in place to help me succeed, because I really want to work hard and I want this to work out, but, tell me a little bit more about what you'll have prepared. If Jane is like, well, you'll go through like orientation, like everyone else, bad answer. But if Jane says, well, you and I will be meeting, in the beginning twice a week for individual supervision. As you get a hang of the job, we'll pull back to maybe once a week. Also, I'm going to have you buddy up, with, Kevin, because Kevin's been doing your job for a while and he's fantastic. So he'll show you some of the ropes and you can, shadow him for a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. What types of things do they have in place to help you succeed? Ask about things like career development, mentoring, sponsoring. Now, just in case you're not aware, there's a difference between mentoring and sponsoring. Mentoring can be done either with someone within the organization or outside of the organization. And that's helping you think about, your career trajectory and thinking about skills that you want to improve upon and giving you advice from lessons that perhaps they have learned, mentoring, right? Sponsoring is always someone who's internal in the company. And that is someone who will help give you access to opportunities for upward mobility. They will, for example, be the one sitting in the C-suite meeting when they're like, we need a new VP of marketing. Who do we have internally? Your sponsor is the one who's going to say, Mary, have you guys thought about Mary? Because she's done this, this, and this. There's a little more to sponsoring, but I'm just trying to show you very quickly the difference between mentoring and sponsoring. You need both, particularly if you are a member of a group that is not, on the golf course, as they say, if you are a person of color, if you are a woman, and other underrepresented groups in the workplace, you definitely want to have a sponsor. Ask the person who you're interviewing with what the most successful people on the team are like and do. If they describe to you, Patrick is fantastic because, he hasn't taken a vacation in 3 years. He's always here. We actually couldn't even make payroll, like last month. And he didn't care. He was like, it's fine. You can owe me next payroll. I don't know. Run if you hear that. But, that's, you don't want to be like that. If that's what they value in a good employee, forget it. But on the other hand, if you're like, the people I can rely on most are the ones who, are total consummate, team players. And, they really know how to take care of themselves so that they're fresh at work every day and they generate new ideas and, they ask questions, all the different types of things that would suggest that it's a safe environment, that they actually take notice of soft skills in their employees, right? Next tip. I only have 3 more. This next one might be a question that you could either ask in an official interview or if you're doing your internal networking, you're gonna have to read the room, but ask the question of what do you wish you had known? What do you know now that you wish you had known before you started working here? That's a very interesting answer that you're gonna get from that, right? Next thing is pay attention to nonverbals. Now, this can be a little more challenging if you're interviewing either by phone. Well, it's actually very challenging by phone, but also by Zoom, but a little easier in person. But pay attention to things like pregnant pauses. If you ask the question, what systems will be in place to support the success of my role should I join your team? And they're like, that's a pregnant pause, right? They waited too long, right? Pay attention to tone of voice, eye movements, facial expressions. Also, if you're on a panel interview, whether that's, in person or through Zoom, if you have, for example, we'll call it the head boss, plus some of the people who might be your colleagues, watch them when the head boss is talking. Are they rolling their eyes? Are they giving one another a glance? Are they making a smirk? Do they seem to feel authorized to ask questions? Or is it just they're there because the boss was like, make it look like we're all a lovey-dovey team, but I'm going to do all the talking? Pay attention to those types of things, okay? Lastly, and then I promise to shut up again, pay attention to the entire hiring process. How have they treated you? right? Recruitment begins from the hiring process. It's not, the whole onboarding and inclusion, all that begins from the very beginning. So how have they treated you? What has their level of communication been? Have they ghosted you for 3 weeks, right? And then finally they were like, can you come in like in an hour from now, and the length of time the entire process took, right? Do they just think you're sitting around waiting for them and 4 months have gone by? Or are they trying to make this as fast as possible because they want you, they value you? And then just what has been their follow through? So are there any other things that people can suggest to look for when interviewing? Okay. Any other, I really want to finish up very quickly for Jane and Mike. Any other questions or thoughts on this overall topic? I know this was like a quick sprint through it because we don't have a lot of time. We could really talk like 5 hours about this, but anything else that anyone wants to add or ask?
The only thing I would add to that last section there, because a lot of people are being referred to jobs now by your network. Ask for somebody else to talk to that they may know that works there outside of, before they even know you're interviewing or any of that, because you'll get a lot of insight. I should have listened to people on my last job when he was referring me and he's the one that got me the interview and what he was telling me in that conversation, but I needed a job so bad that I was ignoring what he was saying. I think, actually listening and believing or at least trusting what they're telling you is a good thing. Because I know one of the ones I wish I would have listened on the fact that the turnover was 123% of the division I was taking over. If I would have let that sink in, probably wouldn't have taken that job. So
right.
That's just my opinion.
And yes, and not only do you want to try to internally network for your department, see if you can network with people in other departments, because your department might be fantastic, but what if marketing and finance are a mess? You have to work with those other departments. That's going to impact your work experience. Yeah. And vice versa. Maybe your department is a mess, but the rest of the organization is great. And maybe they have a job in another department for you.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think turnover is really a key thing. I know in my position, I was 3 months into my current position, and I was now the senior person in the U.S. So it's a small company, but it's a Israeli-based tech company. But I had to look at the guy that I work for and wonder, how did he turn over the entire U.S. organization in the course of 3 months?
Yeah.
So tip off.
Pay attention. Okay. Yes, Ariel, one last thing, and then I really want to turn it over.
You raise a good point. Culture is also a big issue. So remember that if there are leaders from other countries here, if they don't have the right mentorship and, how to do business in the United States, and of course, vice versa, if you go as an expat to another country, you really need to understand the culture, because when someone says, I'll see you at 10 o'clock in Latin America AM, they really mean 11 o'clock. When somebody says something in Germany, it could mean something totally different. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Companies, I don't think, do a good job of that. And there are certain countries that the personalities are very brash, and they focus more on the production and the business. They don't really think about their personalities, because I don't know why. So those are issues to think about also, especially if you bring people over here from other countries. What kind of support and cultural mentoring and coaching will you give them so that they can kind of blend in and, practice more of the way we do business, since they're here trying to do business.
Yes, 1,000%. Everything that I presented is from a very American and particularly Northeast cultural standpoint. Absolutely. Okay, Jane and Mike, take it away.
Mike, do you have anything you want to add in particular at all?
Yeah, so Janet, thank you. This was excellent. You know your stuff. You're great at what you do. And for everyone on the Zoom, take it to heart. this could easily be a 3-day training session. This topic, there's so much to talk about. But thank you, because it was excellent presentation and great information. You know, unfortunately, it takes a village to sometimes turn around corporate culture. It's not HR's department, the HR department's responsibility. Unfortunately, so many companies are cutting back on HR resources, and so many HR departments are just so woefully understaffed. But there's a lot, and to Robert's point, it's amazing how some companies thrive despite a toxic culture. Big wheel keeps on turning. They just keep on turning out those profits. There's a lot to talk about, but I'll just say, again, thank you. And, we're here to help with ManufacturNET and with Jane. But man, there's just so much to talk about. One other point that struck me is too, this might have been, someone said this, but some organizational cultures are such that if someone leaves, you can't replace them. And so you get into this mindset, because everything's a psychology, right? You get into a mindset that keeping a bad employee is better than no employee. So companies sometimes can't help themselves, and just can't. There's only so. But the last thing I'll say is, every one of you are leaders, and so do your part to make change. It could be incremental change, but everyone do your part. Have a voice. Stand up. Say something respectfully. Try to make change. Because all of you are leaders, regardless of level, title, and so forth. So with that, I'll turn it over to my partner there, Jane.
Thank you. Janet's info. Are you seeing my screen, hopefully?
No, not yet.
No. Oh, darn it. Okay. Anyway, I'm trying, Janet, to share your info. I'll email everyone. I don't know why I did it the other time, but I can't do it this time. So,
and for now, I put my LinkedIn link in the chat.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Okay. Well, that's it for us. It's 10:30. I like to stay straight, right on 10:30. So thank you everyone who joined us, and we will give you info on what we're doing next time via LinkedIn and email. All right. Thank you so much.
Have a great
Bye-bye.
day.
Okay. Bye.